Dr. Evans is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, where he co-directs the Modeling Individual and Network Decisions Lab. His work focuses on the intersection of ethics, infectious disease, emerging technologies, and national security. His current major projects focus on ethics of artificial intelligence, funded by the National Institutes of Health, U.S. Army Research Laboratory DevCom, and Greenwall Foundation. Dr. Evans is best known for his work on dual-use research of concern, beneficial scientific research that has a risk of misuse in the development of weapons of mass destruction. Dr. Evans is also a recognized expert in public health ethics, writing on the ethics of social distancing, research ethics during health emergencies, and the use of force in pandemic response. His new book on the ethics of pandemic preparedness and response, War on All Fronts, a theory of health security justice, was published in May 2023. And our third speaker is Joseph Chapa. Joseph Chapa is an officer in the US Air Force and holds a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Oxford. His areas of expertise include just war theory, military ethics, and especially the ethics of remote weapons and the ethics of artificial intelligence. He's a senior pilot with more than 1,400 pilot and instructor pilot hours, and he will be an incoming fellow with the Applied Ethics Center here at UMass Boston. Please welcome our speakers.
Thanks very much for the generous introductions, Michael. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, fantastic. It's such a pleasure to be back to the center. I want to thank NIR for the invitation to join you, all the members of the center, for the important work that you're doing. And I want to apologize. I know that in some respects this was kind of pitched as a neuroethics conference in general, and hence the subject of my principal talk. But I did want to make a few introductory remarks about that are brain-computer interface specific, since this talk is about a more general topic. And that's only because I've been using brain-computer interfaces for the last 20 years, whilst in uniform and out of it, to develop systems for the US military and its allies that leverage brain signals to improve the performance of human-machine teams. So, kind of by way of hard knocks, I've learned a few lessons there. Let me encapsulate those in 2 minutes, so a précis of a different talk, if you will. The first is to note that measuring central nervous system states in a way that makes the signal usable for a non-clinical application is very difficult. We all know that. We've heard about some of the technologies these last 2 days. However, measuring peripheral central nervous system signals is much easier and is extremely useful. And those are legion. Since your brain and body are a complicated and intertwined system, it's actually quite easy to get only one step away from a central nervous system state by measuring something else about your body. So I can measure your heart rate, where you're looking with your eyes, your pupillometry. With lasers, I can actually measure activity on the retina, and the retina just is the tail end of a bunch of neurons, right? It is a neural system, direct neural interface, and so on. So if that's a topic that's of interest, there's a chapter in a book called Humans, Machines, War that just came out of National Defense University Press last year. And I have one chapter in that, and the part of it I'm most proud of is a table that summarizes the literature in these secondary central nervous system states and how they can be sensed. Now, the second point, besides that, is that peripheral nervous system states are very useful to leverage for performance improvement systems, is to say that there are a lot of things we can infer from them. So by looking at pupillometry, for instance, I can make some reliable inferences about arousal and engagement. By looking at heart rate variability, I can make some reliable inferences about your ability to withstand stress. By looking at galvanic skin response, I can get an indirect measure of how much a particular stimulus has startled your brain, and so on. So there's a whole slew of secondary kind of cognitive states that I can make inferences about from those things I can measure peripherally coming from your nervous system. So that then leads to third point, a practical example of applying those signals. This is a project that an old laboratory of mine and I completed for Air Force Research Labs, one of the funding agencies in the Department of Defense for basic and applied research. And what we discovered was that it was possible to use electroencephalograms, so electrodes that sit on top of the scalp to measure electrical activity coming from the brain, to separate the mind ball from the eyeball. What I mean by that is if you're flying a mission as a RPV pilot, I know our third speaker, as a pilot, it's possible to become bored and for your eye to fall upon a critical piece of instrumentation, but for your brain to not bother to consciously process that information. And that's a problem if you're on the first or second line flying a 12-hour RPV mission, with a remote airplane that's, say, in Afghanistan, and whereas, you're in Nevada, where you need to modulate your attention so that you pay attention to the important parts of the mission so that you don't do things like inadvertently cause collateral damage. So it turns out that you can do cross-sensor training using a visual camera and a weight sensor in the seat, such that I can tell by embedding frequencies in the flicker refresh rates of the monitors that the pilots and analysts are looking at, whether or not you are consciously processing the information where your eyeball is looking. So that's pretty important, because when the mind ball and the eyeball separate, I can take an ameliorative action to snap attention back to where it needs to be. I can vibrate a seat, I can sound an alarm, I can flash a red alert so that the mind ball and the eyeball reunite. So that's actually what the system that we built did for intelligence analysts who are part of flying these long remote missions, was reunite the mind ball and the eyeball using this peripheral neural state sensing technology. And that resulted in performance improvement, more analysis of legitimate targets that were part of these mission packages. So that then finally leads me to my last point, and then we'll get into an artificial conscience. And that is to say that when I build those systems against a background of things like informed consent and all the usual things that we need to consider when we think about the ethics of these technologies, there are really two things I worried about most. The first was something called the lumberjack effect. And that is an effect from psychology where people notice that when you bring in your expert lumberjack to supervise less senior lumberjacks, that sometimes you actually got worse outcomes, despite that expertise being there as you felled a tree, just because the expert did not have the situational awareness they needed at the time they were brought into the team to exercise that good judgment to know where the tree would fall as they were felling trees for timber. Right? So that's called the lumberjack effect, and it's something that you need to be concerned about with these type of performance improvement systems that leverage these signals. Because if you're bringing a soldier or an airman or a sailor into the situation only at the exact moment when they need to exercise critical human judgment, they're going to be subject to the lumberjack effect. Situational awareness is going to be exceedingly important. Otherwise, you could actually wind up in a worse space than if you had never had an autonomous system doing things for the soldier or the airman to begin with. The second thing that you need to worry about is what I would call cognitive burnout. And it's something that you see in things like RPV pilots who have basal rates of post-traumatic stress disorder that are higher than average, actually, even for deployed people. And part of the reason why that happens is because of the constant stresses that you face when you're brought into these type of situations. So we may unreflectively think it's good to build a system that only brings the human in when they're needed to make a critical judgment. But if that means you spend 8 hours making critical judgments, you are going to be exhausted at the end of that shift in a way that you would not have been otherwise. And so I worry that we might, in a sense, be doing a form of moral harm to soldiers if we ask them to leverage these performance improvement systems that I have a hand in building, I will say, day in and day out, and we need to be aware of that. Okay, so that took 4 minutes rather than 2. My apologies. That's a précis of a longer talk. And let me segue from those homely observations about brain-computer interfaces and their use in the military into a topic that I think is going to be most relevant for the center as it starts to explore autonomy in the next 2 years. And that's how we might be able to use artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques to build a decision aid that can help soldiers make morally praiseworthy decisions downrange as they deal with difficult circumstances. So I think we can build an artificial conscience, and I want to make that case for you over the next 9 minutes that I have left. So what is an artificial conscience? I'll talk a little bit about that. Why would we want to build one? I'll cover both some empirical and theoretical concerns. I'll do a little bit of engineering with you. How would we actually build such a decision aid? And then big picture, what we think about as we attempt to field an artificial conscience. And I want to conclude, spend most of my time actually on some risks that I see as we build these systems. I am an optimist, or I wouldn't be the technologist that I've been. I think we should develop these systems, but we need to be highly aware of the risks so that we can regulate them or potentially use a free market mechanism in order to curtail those risks. So an artificial conscience is a decision aid for human-in-the-loop systems. I would argue that something like an artificial conscience can be a critical faculty for entirely autonomous systems that will exist in the battlefields of the future. We're already seeing autonomous robots being deployed in the Ukraine and Russian front. As hypersonic weapons come to the fore and are used in major power conflict, you're going to have autonomous systems that are acting quickly, and that are acting more quickly than humans have the ability to remain on the loop for. So I think we really need something like a critical faculty for these entirely autonomous systems. I see an artificial conscience as being very grounded. It embodies 4 capacities that Jim Rest, one of my favorite moral psychologists, identified. That's the ability to be morally sensitive, that is to know what facts about a situation are morally relevant, to exercise moral judgment, to know what moral principles and theories you need to bear on those facts in order to know what to do, to be motivated to act on those judgments. Think of acrasia and weakness of the will and the Aristotelian corpus, things that are very important to think about when we engineer systems. And finally, one that's neglected, the capacity to have the skill to act on those judgments. So that can include things like theory of mind, for instance. Right? I may know that it would be morally unjustified for me to cause unnecessary offense to you as I give this presentation, but if I cannot use a theory of mind mechanism to predict what might cause you offense, then I don't have the skill required in order to follow the mandate that, as we give presentations, we ought not to cause unnecessary offense. So these 4 things, I would argue, are probably necessary and sufficient conditions. I know that's a strong claim to build, to engineer an artificial conscience. Now, a critical turning point will be to say then, what principles of reason for that second part especially, the judgment piece, are going to be present in this artificial conscience? There, I think we have to start with traditional moral theory that I know all of you are the subject matter experts in. The shorthand that I've used when teaching military ethics in the past is to think of the 3 C's, but character, consent, and consequence, all capturing at least 3 major Western traditions in ethical reasoning that our lunchtime speaker just laid out wonderfully. And maybe we should add in a 4C that somehow refers to African vitalism, for instance. I will note later that these 3 C's aren't comprehensive, right? They're a place for us to start. And I do think we have to internationalize these, ultimately. I would love for the moral systems that regulate battlefield behavior in the long run, that are autonomous, to be governed by rules and standards that are part of an international compact. I don't know how many years I have left on this earth, but that's something I would love to help broker over the course of the next 10 years so that we can, if we have to fight, at least do it in a way that respects fundamental decent principles of discrimination and proportionality. So, why would we want to build that thing? I'll focus on the defense context for right now, but you might need an artificial conscience in many domains of life where autonomous systems operate. First, I think autonomy on the battlefield is inevitable. It's a one-way ratchet type of technology. So many military technologies are like this. When you field them and they offer some slight competitive advantage, then they will proliferate. And I think that autonomous systems will offer competitive advantages on the battlefield in many respects. So we need to get ahead of the ball as these systems start to become fielded so that we can regulate them appropriately. Second, it's perverse. While we don't like to acknowledge it, our own military doctrine actually requires it. So if you dive down into the rules and regulations that govern when a human has to be on the loop for a use of force decision, like the release of a bomb or the firing of a bullet, our doctrine requires that we engineer systems that advise on these decisions. And that's why if you look at all of the research labs, Air Force research labs, Office of Naval Research, Army research labs, et cetera, DARPA, IARPA, others, your acronym soup from the military world, you'll find that many of them do have research projects in this area. The most recent one being one that DARPA launched last year called Asimov. That is in reference to Isaac Asimov's infamous 3 laws of robotics. That stands for autonomy standards integrated with military operational values. Yeah. A contrived acronym. And that military operational values part is just DARPA's way of saying ethics without saying ethics, given that we can't use the ethics word or the M word, morality word with the current administration. So the Allied military doctrine ultimately requires building these systems. And while the competitive nature of national security, as I mentioned earlier, does act as a driver for this technology, that presents a risk to us. If we don't onboard moral reasoning onto these systems, that means adversaries that don't share our same scruples could exploit our high visibility failure to do so. So we failed. I failed insofar as I'm part of this enterprise on the very first day of the war with Iran when we used Tomahawk land attack missiles to accidentally, unintentionally strike a school and killed over 170 school children, right? That is a failure. And those kinds of failures can accumulate and undermine the moral basis you have for waging a war, even when the war is otherwise entirely justified, not necessarily that the Iran war is. And an adversary could cause our systems to take those kinds of actions in such a way that we couldn't fight even a good war. Finally, morality demands it. If we get better moral performance, if you will, out of a human-machine team that incorporates an artificial conscience than not, then I think morality itself actually demands that we field these systems. These systems, I believe, will take the way that humans reason about morality seriously. This is an eye chart, I know. This is the Wikipedia Cognitive Bias Codex. If you pull it up on Wikipedia, you can see it. It points out that our human brains are these Swiss Army knives that really have four major categories of problems they have to deal with. The problem of too much information, top right. The problem of not enough meeting the stimulus, bottom right. The problem of knowing what's important, what should I remember, top left, and the problem of needing to act quickly often. Think of a hypersonic missile on the battlefield that has to make a moral decision in milliseconds, if you will. And that has resulted in our brain developing heuristics and biases that allow us to know what's important, to act quickly even in the face of incomplete information, to fill in the gaps when information is missing, and to provide meaning to non-meaning-laden stimuli. And all of the shortcuts in human cognition that cause failures to reason well are present in this wheel, as well as ones that are ecologically valid, that is, that work most of the time in a Gerd-Gigerenzer style fashion. Right? Think of the recall heuristic. Which city is bigger, X or Y? And you recognize city Y, so you say it is bigger, and it turns out that your ability to recall the name of the city is actually linked to the number of times you've heard it, and that's linked in a law-like fashion to how big it is. Right? So that heuristic, the recall heuristic, works as a great way to judge the population size of a city, even though it's, formally speaking, invalid. So we're going to have to build heuristics and biases and other methods of reasoning that our brains already use into this artificial conscience. We'll probably use those 3 C's that I mentioned as a foundation, either trained or hand-coded. And what I mean by trained is as we implement techniques in machine learning, we're probably going to have a type of moral development for these systems like you have with your sons and daughters, your children. Where we put them through a series of exercises to test their capabilities, where we come up with both mainline and edge cases that can train them well so that they become virtuous consciences that we can be proud of. So we might think of conscience as emerging from other types of reasoning, so we might have emergent artificial consciences. We might use traditional symbolic approaches, first order predicate calculus. We have types of modal logic that are essentially Kantian in nature for helping us reason about perfect duties, deontic logic, etc. But the third possibility here, I think, is the one where we're going to see the most action, using biologically realistic approaches as embedded in deep learning to essentially come up with a moral Olympics that might allow us to train these systems so they can work well and be sensitive to those contexts that they have to be sensitive to reason well. All right, my last 2 minutes, some concerns and rejoinders. Well, what values are we going to hardwire or train into this system? Whose justice, which rationality, Alistair McIntyre might say. I just want to know that this is not a unique objection. We already face this question with humans in the loop, with the training we do with soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Guardians every day. We probably will need a transparent democratic process as we build this artificial conscience. In that respect, I think it's exactly like the regulatory mechanisms we use for the cognitive science that somebody like Phil Kitcher talks about in a couple of his books. You might be concerned that it's not possible to build this artificial conscience because it's not actually a conscience, or it's really hard to do. in which case you have nothing to fear. Don't call it a conscience, call it a small little decision day that makes no metaphysical claims about morality that nonetheless helps us act better on the battlefield. I'm happy. But keep in mind, we don't want to import outdated assumptions about the nature of cognition, right? I think the success of deep learning highlights the fact that when our ways of reasoning with machines start to resemble those that we use to reason, that we might be able to close a metaphysical gap that would otherwise exist. Finally, of course, you need trust and transparency in these mechanisms, because if you don't have that, you might reject them or you might turn them off. We're going to have proper design, education, and actual use to build trust in these systems as we deploy them. By way of exiting stage right, there are some risks to building this system. We might lose everyday moral expertise that's relevant to warfare. If you rely too much on an artificial conscience, you might enter the cognitive shallows of moral reasoning. And that's a concern. It could be that soldiers who oversee the operation of these systems become a little bit like YouTube content moderators, who are exposed to the hardest cases only day in and day out, as an upstream, some artificial conscience sends them a very difficult edge case to deal with. Can you imagine what that might be like if you're making continuous decisions about combatancy status for school children in yards, right next to weapons of mass destruction facilities? We kind of amplified the moral hazard that we're presenting to warfighters. We might also get supervisory exhaustion. There was a recent Boston Consulting Group study that noted that once a person oversees more than about 3 agents that are working to generate autonomous judgments, that it's very easy to become exhausted when you supervise them. Think if you had 20 graduate students you had to supervise in a single semester. I would say that in general, we're still coming to grips with the agentic AI revolution, and that's going to impact how we build an artificial conscience. And there is a chance that AI's use in warfare overall, including the use of regulatory moral agents, will lead to more persistent conflict. That is because this offers a form of asymmetric advantage for those who would otherwise have been overwhelmed. Think about what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. And one important dynamic that does cause us to moderate warfare is things like the type of unintended consequences you see with the loss of innocent life that generally cause democracies to curtail support for long wars. And those mechanisms could be undermined, and we need to take that seriously. Thank you very much.
It is always difficult to follow Bill. It's a real privilege to be on this panel. Bill and Joe kind of mark 2 different chapters in my career working in kind of the ethics of defense and technology. Bill for his work on neuroscience. I ended up writing a book about Bill's work at DARPA, so it's very weird to be in the same room as him as one of your subjects. And then Joe for the work that he's done across the DoD, but especially at the Air Force on values in artificial intelligence. I'm going to talk to you about a project that I've been working on. So this is my mandatory funding declaration. The ones that are asterisks are ones that I'm currently suing the US government to get back. I would like my money back, please. And of course, my views do not reflect any of my funders, something for which they are profoundly grateful. As was introduced to me, I am the co-director of Modeling Individual and Network Decisions, or MIND, at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, with my colleague and friend, Dr. Neil Shortland. He's a Brit, I'm an Australian, and in the Commonwealth, you are taught to stand in exactly the same way, I realized, for photos. But I have better hair than he does. And between us, we have approximately 14 people that we work with at the university, among dozens of collaborators here in the United States and abroad. So I'm going to talk about what I view as kind of the next step in what Bill was talking about. And a lot of what Bill was talking about was our ability now to read human behavior from a range of biological and neurological signals to a very high degree of fidelity. Now, of course, the next step is then the writing of those signals into other things, which is kind of the holy grail of the brain-computer interface. I wrote my first paper on the ethics of brain-computer interfaces as a baby graduate student in 2008. And I am pleased to say that not a lot has happened in the field when it comes to writing in terms of what people who write on the ethics of this space would really like to have happened, right? The science is amazing, right? The science, however, is not near the point that people want it to be for kind of the transhuman future. So in honor of my hosts, right, I am neither a bioconservative nor a transhumanist. I tend to be a cynic, not in the like pessimistic view, but more in the kind of Diogenes view, in the sense that I like to try and talk about the science where it is and as fascinating it is and what it would take to then make some of the things we desire real. And to that note, in the center, we have at the top is the longest current owner, let's say, of a brain-computer interface. He's been wearing it for 9 years. And the bottom is the first Neuralink patient who's been wearing his for a little under 12 months now. But where people have been talking about since the 1960s with people like J.C. Linkleiter, is we want cyborgs, right? Everyone wants cyborgs. Don't lie. When I am relaxing from the horrors of the world at large at the moment, I play a disgusting amount of the computer game Marathon, in which private military contractors can kind of beam their mental states directly into synthetic bodies that they then run around and murder each other in. And I get to do that on a computer to relax from suing the federal government, which is great, by the way, because I can do things on the computer that I'm not allowed to do in real life. But that's where we kind of want to go with the right situation, right? Not you maybe, but that is where the US government has been thinking for more than half a century. And my question to you is, what would it even take to build a system like that, much less to build a system that coheres to certain fundamental norms that we have about the nature of armed conflict, but also perhaps certain kind of fears and hopes that we have about the nature of human enhancement. Now, I'm not going to talk to you about the treatment enhancement distinction because other people have done that already, and there is, I was recently at a conference about lifelike systems, so the interface between chemistry and biology, and we were explicitly forbidden from discussing what constitutes life, right? So I feel that sometimes panels on neurotech should be forbidden from talking about treatment versus enhancement in the same way. But what I do want to talk to you about is that though I'm trained in kind of a bioethics capacity, a lot of my work over the last 20 years starting in grad school has really moved from what you might call moral philosophy, right? So thinking about substantive, defensible questions about right and wrong, to political philosophy, right? To think about how we actually design institutions given facts about moral pluralism, right? And the facts of reasonable disagreement about substantive views of the world. And that is partly because I tend to find myself very much in the meta-ethical camp of people like Richard Joyce. Sorry, Bill. Bill's written a book about moral naturalism, which is very good. In that it's not entirely clear to me that our moral facts are kind of really truth-apt in the way that we hope them to be, right? Now, that doesn't mean that they're not real in the sense that we believe them, but now we're kind of left with the project of how we all then live with each other, which I find to be the rewarding and interesting set of philosophical questions, and these are some of my influences. So, one of the great things about working in the ethics of enhancement in the military, apart from the fact that there are way more famous Australians who think about the ethics of enhancement generally than I, and they are fortunately much more expensive to fly to Boston than I am, is that the military is a very siloed, kind of distinct organization, even within kind of the rest of liberal democratic institutions. And the basic reasons why we want to regulate enhancements, the positive account for regulating enhancements, is that we don't always know that they work. And if they do work, we don't know how. And if they do work and we know how, we often don't know what their side effects are or in what combinations they should be taken. Right? So even something as simple as caffeine, we know that caffeine will keep you vigilant in the psychological sense, right? It'll allow you to retain concentration for extended period of time over a task. It is a performance-enhancing substance, but if you were to consult the literature on the causal mechanism of why, you would get as many answers as there are papers. And we know this because we did a systematic review of the performance-enhancing literature on caffeine, and we found that the modal number of measures per paper is 7, right? So basically the way that you determine that caffeine is performance enhancing is you measure everything, right? And then something is significant and you say, well, that's the thing that matters. Now, In defense context, making sure that these things work is extremely important. You have to make sure that they work in the right ways, because when you enhance someone's cognition, you don't always enhance all of their cognition, right? You have to make sure it's enhanced in the right ways for the task, right? So very famously, the first Canadian loss of life in Operation Iraqi Freedom was an incident called the Tarnack Farms incident, and that is where US soldiers, I believe they were actually Marines, opened fire on what they thought were insurgents that turned out to be Canadians. And one of the things in the investigation that followed was that they were on very high levels of dextroamphetamines. Now, the causation is obviously really hard to demonstrate, but one of the things we have thought about very heavily since then is what counts as too much of a good thing for a particular kind of engagement. And this is really important because the kinds of enhancements that we're talking about are under very extreme conditions often. So a lot of the work we do around cognitive enhancement concerns tier 1 operators from special operations forces, right? And these people operate in very extreme conditions for long periods of time where they are required to do very dangerous things that would stress anybody out. And as I'm sure you all know, when you take caffeine on a Sunday morning, it's very different from when you're taking your 7th caffeine on a deadline for a grant and you're stressed out of your mind, right? The same principles apply. But we accept certain normative, and that's legal and moral kind of norms, exceptionalism in national defense context. We even have a nice Latin phrase for it. It's the lex specialis, right? So the law of war is often considered to be distinct from civilian kind of criminal and civil law. And interestingly enough, for kind of my research purposes, is that especially in the US Department of Defense, the research development, testing, and evaluation cycle is very well put together, right? There are, in fact, 7 budget codes, 6.1 through 6.7, which can tell you where a technology or a procedure is in the stage that you are thinking about applying it to actual human beings, right? So all of my funding is considered 6.1 research. I'm a basic research scientist, according to the US government, but then that arc can kind of progress all the way through to demonstration of prototypes, understanding how you actually manage a system at an operational level, and then deploying it. And so we can understand where enhancements are, and let me tell you, when it comes to brain-computer interfaces, 6.1 to 6.2 is kind of where we sit for the most part, especially when it comes to writing things. And that's because the dominant form of writing that we have for brain-computer interfaces is typically in the realm of quadriplegia. Thank you. I'm going to go through this quickly, right? Because there is, there are standing, understood balances of civil and political rights weighed against military necessity that really kind of dial in how we think about the normative regime for institutions like the military. And maintaining cognitive function, we know, up to and beyond species-typical functioning, is a perennial problem in defense contexts. People who fight wars, they're always tired, and they always need to not be tired. And so this is critical to mission effectiveness, but it does come with trade-offs in upholding other norms, like whether or not you know the people you're shooting at are the people you should be shooting at. A caveat, we're also generally terrible at supporting cognitive function through normal means and treating our soldiers well, and that becomes really important. So what I propose is that because we have this basic rights tension, right, we have the individual rights when it comes to imposing enhancements that soldiers retain, right? And they're understood to hold these domestically, internationally, but subject to certain caveats of military necessity, we can adopt similar kinds of principles that we do for many other kinds of rights infringing processes, right? So military necessity, proportionality, compliance with existing legal documents, and what I call minimally invasive effects, right? So this is a variation on least restrictive alternative, where we shouldn't be putting chips in people's brains, where training them using neuromodulation would work just as well. Plus, I think we need to seriously consider harm reduction, and then post-deployment and post-separation, that is when you leave the force, support for veterans who have otherwise been enhanced. And we can then apply this to a research structure portfolio, right? So priority setting is where we kind of think about our basic research. As we circle around the pipeline, we then get into research ethics, how we conduct clinical human trials on various forms of neuroenhancement. We then think about human factors and trust and influence, right? So this is how we actually integrate with these technologies at an operational level before thinking about jurisprudence, right? Which is the philosophy of law around how we actually go about implementing these things. And because we can do social sciences and humanities independent of the tech development cycle, we are not limited to waiting until the technology exists before we do the last phase. So to finish up with an applied case, under what conditions do we develop and use neuromodulation of aggression in defense contexts? Right, so there is already like a trough. This is one of these like things that neurotech people love to do. They love to give you some transcranial stimulation somewhere on your head, and then they kind of measure certain psychological responses, such as whether or not you have become more or less aggressive. And in military contexts, this is often thought to be really important because there are some times in the military when you want to be extremely aggressive, and there are other times when you want to be much less aggressive, right? Depending on whether you're dealing with people with guns or kind of the average tribesman who probably also has a gun but is not pointing it at you. So fundamental questions obtain: what is aggression? What is its function? So on and so forth. But then there's a need, kind of questions about the need for this neuromodulation, the available of less invasive techniques, its interaction with international humanitarian law. Does increasing aggression pose risks to international humanitarian law, which Blake Hereth and I discussed in a paper a couple of years ago. And then how we set our clinical endpoints, how we set our interactions, how we understand adverse events and participant safety, and then norm setting, engaging with the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and then the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons at the United Nations level. So to finish up, one of the really important things about military enhancement is that the military in some ways are already people who are enhanced, right? They take vast quantities of caffeine, usually amphetamines. The Air Force is a very modafinil-centric group these days, and modafinil, by the way, is really, really fun to take. But we are now in a place where we need to understand how we do all this in an operational, institutional setting, knowing that more things are coming down the pipeline and knowing that you can't just stack enhancements on top of each other as you go, right? So this is the research program that I would invite you to consider and get involved in, because right now the people who think about the ethics of military enhancement can be counted on one hand, and many of them are retiring, is how does international humanitarian law limit, how do the limits set by international humanitarian law map to cognitive processes, right? What are certain type of cognitive states that we want to avoid for the purposes of fulfilling our obligations under international humanitarian law? How do we protect a minimum cognitive ecology, right? How do you not change the warfighter's brain so much that it can never be changed back for the purpose of reintegrating to society, right? This is already a problem without sticking chips in people's brains. What are the export control regulations over putting a chip in someone's brain if they leave the service, right? If it's classified, right? If the chip itself is classified, what happens if someone's walking around with it? And then what is the long-term ownership over and welfare with these kinds of enhancements for soldiers long-term? Then how do we set norms, right? In the Convention on Certain Weapons, with the International Committee on the Red Cross, less with the Biological Weapons Convention. This is a bugbear of mine as a guy who goes to the BWC meetings. The way that the architecture of the BWC works, super soldiers are never going to find a place in there, for better or worse, and it's probably better because the BWC is a trash fire of a convention. Formal priority setting, right? What enhancements matter? Which ones should we avoid? And how do we actually determine a process for setting those? Research ethics challenges, because right now our research ethics infrastructure is not set up to test enhancements on healthy volunteers, right? IRBs will send you away. And if you want to do enhancement of any kind, including for keeping people alive in some of the harshest circumstances that they can be in, you need to have a better research pipeline to do so. How do we trial the supplements in the GNCs that exist on every military base in the country and figure out which of them are sugar pills, which of them are poison, and kind of how they interact with the things that we want to put in soldiers' bodies. And then improvements in military medicine and psychology, to which I will leave you a 2023 study around gendered differences in military fitness assessments found that one of the reasons that women typically do worse on military fitness assessments has nothing to do with kind of gender, because it is confounded by exposure to impact sports at an early age, right? So women who were allowed to play rugby as kids, right, did just as well as men on these fitness assessments. Why is that? Because bone calcification and all of the kinds of things that impact sports give you when you do them at a young age are actually the determinative factor here, more than whatever chromosomes you were born with, right? And so we actually don't know enough about human performance before we make cyborgs to ever successfully, I think, make cyborgs the way that we are now. So if you are a transhumanist, I think you should get on some of this. And if you are not, I think that this is an opportunity for this political project of shaping what the soldier of the future looks like can actually be done. But it has to be a process. It's not something we can do in principle, and it's not something that we can do kind of in abstraction. It actually needs to be done as thinking about what this institution is and planning for it, not just for tomorrow, but for 10, 20, 30 years in the future. So that's my kind of notes. Thank you very much, and I'll pass it over to Joe.
As you heard, my name is Joe Chapa. I'm an active duty Air Force officer. The views expressed are my own and don't reflect any of the organizations that I work for. I want to echo the thanks of the other speakers, for the organizers, for Nir and Michael and all the work that you did, and for Jay for supporting it. And especially for inviting me to be a fellow starting next year. As you heard from my bio, this is not my primary area of work. And especially following this august panel, I hope only that my talk isn't so bad that they rescind the fellowship offer. Just trying to set a high standard here right at the beginning. I'm going to point out two things to you. One is the sketch in the background of these slides. If you're wondering why the slides look the way they do, why there's that AI reference in the top left corner. I don't know if you're familiar. People have been recommending a lot of good books over the last day and a half. Maybe you're familiar with Gary Chapman's book, The 5 Love Languages. I think it's great, but he missed the 6th love language, which is free books. My book, AI for the Rest of Us, comes out with Air University Press in August, which means it'll be free. You can download it for free, and I'm pretty excited about that. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about virtues and vampires. And so we've heard a lot about almost in principle concerns about human enhancements even in the military. You just saw the paper that Nick referenced, right? That many of these proposed human advancements are going to be morally impermissible for whatever reason. I really want to focus narrowly on just one and try to think through what might the ethics look like of one possible, maybe not right now, but possible in the near future, advancement that might be offered to military members through BCI. So I'm going to start with 3 premises. I think these are not very contentious views, but I want to get them on the table. So first, I think that AI, among other things, but AI in the last several years is shrinking the decision cycle in warfare. You can pick up, almost literally any book on the changing character of war, and the author will say something about how the speed of decision making is rapidly advancing, even more rapidly than it did during the 1990s when we started getting into this network-centric warfare thing that we do so well. And so this is just the John Boyd's OODA loop, the observe, orient, decide loop. If that's getting tighter, if that decision speed is getting quicker, that's going to have implications for what I'm going to talk about. Second of all, I want to sort of describe the BCI that I have in mind. I apologize, this Iron Man GIF is going to run until infinity, no pun intended. I was watching all of the Marvel movies with my son, and we just got to this one about a month ago, and I thought the timing was perfect. So what I am imagining is a brain-computer interface, kind of like this one, that says on your actual human perception with your eyes, imagine that the brain-computer interface can provide to you in your human vision the output of an AI system that's doing something like distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants. If that's the case, then I want to ask what might the ethical implications be, and I want to try to take a different style of argument. So I'm sure you've heard arguments about things like, well, is there going to be some kind of asymmetry when those soldiers return back to normal life? Now they have this capability that their peers don't have. That's a concern, I think. We heard about coercion in the military, right? I have constraints on some of my rights that you don't have because I'm in the military. Are we worried about things like that? I think those are good arguments, but I want to try to do something slightly different. So this is what I have in mind on the BCI in question. And then third, I want to suggest that it's very possible that this increasing rate of decision making could become so fast that it's not really plausible for a human to execute judgment over the decision-making task, right? I with great trepidation, I'm going to mention this article from 972 magazine. I'm sure you saw it in news coverage. The claim is that there was an anonymous, that is unnamed source from within the IDF that claimed that the use of the Lavender AI-enabled targeting system was producing nominated targets so quickly that although there was human oversight, the human oversight became just a rubber stamp on the machine output. The reason I want to offer a caveat is that although I saw this claim mentioned in literally dozens of publications, they all come back to this one article with an unnamed source, so I'm a little wary about the coverage, but we can at least imagine a case, right? If it helps you to notionally enter this space with this proposed case, then I offer it to you as an example. If it's a distraction, then put it aside. All I'm suggesting is, I think it is a very real possibility that the rate of decision-making in war, especially as it pertains to targeting, might be so fast that even the human judgment that is required under Department of Defense Directive 3000.09 is kind of something that is for show only, right? It becomes pro forma, it becomes a rubber stamp. That's a concern I have. This is premise 3. So all of these premises get me to a place where I want to say, what happens to a human person when they enter the military? They're given this BCI. The BCI allows them to see identification, friend or foe, essentially, on their human vision. And then through the other tools, they can act very, very quickly, maybe even more quickly than it would be possible to evaluate with their human judgment the output of that AI system. Are you with me so far? Okay, so we've heard about L.A. Paul's work already today. In chapter 1 of the book, she talks about the vampire problem, right? So again, if this is a distraction for you, set it aside. But the idea is, how could anybody want to be a vampire, right? Vampires stay up all night and they drink human blood and they live forever. That sounds very unpleasant. And yet somehow, once a person becomes a vampire, they do in fact like doing those things, right? So before we become a vampire, we don't have access to the epistemology required to understand why the vampire life might be a good life. Then we enter vampiredom. We now have access to this new epistemology, and we realize that now we actually do like doing those things. The vampire sort of case is a stand-in for major life changes like having children or getting married, right? We're on the front end of that decision. I have 2 kids. Before my kids were born, I could see objective evidence looking at my family and friends who had kids, and I could make some guesses about what might it be like to love my children, right? But I had no subjective access to what those feelings would actually be. Then I have the children, or had my first child, and now I know subjectively what it's like to love my child. Couldn't have access to that epistemic resource until I'm in that condition. So what I want to submit is that joining the military is a vampire problem transition. It's a transformative experience, both personally and epistemologically, and epistemically, to the degree that one does not know what it is like to go to war, to quote Karl Mallantes' book title, until one goes to war. Right? And what I want to suggest is that in the United States military, and I'm going to broaden that to say modern Western professional military, so I'm not thinking about sort of 14th century feudal militaries. I'm not thinking about militaries in authoritarian regimes. I'm talking about modern Western professionalized militaries. I think it is the case that a person joins the military under the vampire problem, not knowing what it's going to be like to be in the military. And yet they have good, not subjective, but sort of objective third-party reasons. They have a legitimate justification for believing that they can join the military, maybe even go fight in a war, and also cultivate virtue and flourish as a human person. I don't know if that's contentious for you. It's not contentious for me at all, having spent a lot of time thinking about military virtue. And I think the only reason this works out is because a person, just like before I had kids, I could look at my sister and say, well, I can see a little bit what it's like for her, so I can have some access, right? Likewise, people considering joining the military might look at other examples and say, oh, it looks like other people have been able to cultivate virtue and flourish after having joined the military. So I think this is the status quo. I want to sort of build an analogy here between an older conversation about virtue cultivation, not with respect to BCI, but with respect to drones. So about 15 years ago, Rob Sparrow and Jesse Kirkpatrick got in a fight in the pages of the Journal of Military Ethics. It started with a book chapter that Rob Sparrow wrote, and then Jesse argued back, and they did about 3 rounds. And ultimately what their disagreement came down to is this. Rob Sparrow makes the claim that drone pilots, that is my friends and I, can't possibly cultivate the virtue of courage. For instance, he talks about courage, honor, loyalty, mercy. I'm just going to talk about courage here for simplicity. So he says the drone crew that's in Nevada or whatever can't possibly cultivate the virtue of courage because they're not under fire, right? And Jesse comes back and says, well, and it takes him a while to get there, but eventually Kirkpatrick comes back and says, but what about other non-military examples of people who cultivate courage, right? Isn't it possible that, you know, an EMT could cultivate courage in the way that they respond to emergencies, right? Firemen can cultivate courage. A surgeon could cultivate courage. And Sparrow's response to that is by saying, fine, but if they do, if the fireman does cultivate courage in the course of doing fireman things, it's not martial courage. Whatever it is, it's not the martial virtue courage. And Kirkpatrick rejects that, saying, no, there's only one courage, right? So when we talk about the martial virtues, this is my view now, and I think I'm aligned with Kirkpatrick on this. When I talk about the martial virtues, I'm talking about character virtues that are character virtues as such in an Aristotelian or neo-Aristotelian system that are particularly valuable for military people in a martial role. I'm not saying there's a list of virtues and then I have a separate list of martial virtues, so that there's human courage and then there's martial courage. I think that to the degree that that makes sense, it makes a discussion of the martial virtues not a conversation about virtues anymore. It's a conversation about something different. And one implication of that is that in that case, being able to carry a heavy rucksack is a martial virtue. And I just don't think that fits in the Aristotelian system. Okay, so in the context of that debate, one of the things that falls out of that is that we have to recognize at least the possibility that a person's full flourishing human life might come from their virtue cultivation outside of the military, right? Even though they might also be able to cultivate some virtues within the military. And I raise that here because that's actually a point against my thesis. So I study philosophy. I always have more questions than I have answers. So I just want to sort of open up 3 questions that I think fall out of this brief discussion, trying to put this 10-year-old debate about martial virtue and drones in the context of this sort of more novel question about brain-computer interface. So here's question number 1. So my sort of the broad sweeping view here is, if we were able to impose the kind of Iron Man BCI that I suggested, it makes me wonder whether a prospective person joining the military could in fact justifiably believe that they can cultivate virtue in the same way that traditional military people have. And there's nuance here, and that's what these 3 questions are for. So first, what's raised in the Iron Man-like BCI example is, I think, phronesis, this is interesting to me, right? So Sparrow wanted to talk about courage, honor, loyalty, mercy. I think I want to fight with him a little bit on whether honor is a virtue. Aristotle kind of says it's not, but fine. He talks about courage, honor, loyalty, mercy. Phronesis is different because Aristotle considers phronesis to be a virtue of the intellect, not a virtue of character, but unlike the intellectual virtues that can be cultivated in a classroom, Aristotle does say you need experience to cultivate phronesis. In my sort of knowledge of what it takes to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants in the fog of war, that is phronesis at work. I don't think it's possible for a human to do the work of discriminating between combatants and non-combatants in war without employing phronesis. If that's given to me on my sort of, ocular view of the world as an output from an AI system, and I'm given no time to sort of execute human judgment over that output, I think what I lose is the ability to practice phronesis. And again, this is a question more than it is a firm conclusion, right? But does that affect this vampire problem? Does that put a person in a position to say, I don't actually know if serving in the military under those conditions would allow me to cultivate the virtue of phronesis? And again, I'm going to flag that you could still cultivate phronesis in your, outside of your 9-to-5 military work. I think that's possible. Okay, question number 2. Do modern Western professionalized militaries, do we have a moral obligation as an institution, those prospective members, a reasonable expectation that they can cultivate virtue? In this case, I'm focused on phronesis. But I think this is an important question, right? Up till now, at least again, my assessment, in the post-Vietnam War, in the era of the all-volunteer force of the United States military, it has been the case for most of that period that I think people had a reasonable expectation that they could join the military and cultivate virtue. If the technology puts us in a position where we're no longer able to make that promise, are we somehow failing prospective military members? It's an open question, but here's the reason I think that matters. This whole discussion about military technology is almost always framed in terms of strategic competition with China, in the same way that during the Cold War, it was almost always framed in terms of strategic competition with the Soviet Union. I'm not here to say that doesn't matter. I think strategic competition with China matters a great deal, right? But the question is, what are the limits to the principles involved? If you're interested, there is a really very funny Saturday Night Live sketch with Simu Liu, who had played Shang-Chi. So he's promoting the Shang-Chi movie. Man, I got a lot of Marvel references in here today. And he plays an army general in the bowels of the Pentagon. And his civilian overlords come down to see what he's working on. And he's working on a program called Doghead Man, which is literally a human cast member puts their arms through the trench coat, and then the dog is a golden retriever, like a dog. And the dog did not follow the script, and hilarity ensues. And the punchline of the sketch is that the civilian powers that be say, this is the dumbest thing I've ever seen, shut it down. And Simu Liu's character says, we can't shut it down because China's pursuing Doghead Man technology, right? And the civilians are like, give him more money, he needs $1 billion. And caricatures are funny because they emphasize real things, right? So that dynamic in the Pentagon is a real thing that says if China's doing it, we have to do it also. And part of what I'm doing here is trying to put pressure on our sort of Western way of developing militaries to say, where is the point at which we would break from what China's willing to do? This might be one of those places. So if we, professional Western modern militaries, owe some obligation to prospective members to ensure that they can cultivate virtue, I don't know that China's going to come up with the same answer to that question. I could imagine China as a much more, I'm not a China scholar, but I read China scholars, and I can imagine China as a much more collectivist institution saying, no, that your individual liberties are less valuable than we might think in the West, and therefore we are going to subject you to this technology where you can't cultivate these virtues. That's something that's interesting to me, because at some point it might put us in a situation where we say, hey, this far and no farther. We recognize the Doghead Man phenomenon, but we're not going to pursue China all the way to where they're going to go for reasons that are important to us as Western societies. That's all I got. I look forward to hearing your questions.
Questions? Please raise your hand if you have a question for one of our panelists.
Well, while you're getting yourself settled, first, I've got to say I could listen to you guys for hours. That was terrific and fascinating. I'm wondering how one deals with something that I think Dr. Casebeer first raised, which is the diversity across the planet of the values that might be embedded in these systems, coupled with the notion of asymmetries. That is, you could build a system, in theory, that incorporates certain kinds of value judgments that, for better or worse, would then be fed to our warfighters who would react for better or worse in light of that information. But an adversary might build in slightly different values. I mean, we all know about the trolley car problem and these kinds of problems that, make you make choices between really unfortunate alternatives, but we can choose differently, right? Are you imagining a world in which adversaries operate, as they do now, frankly, with very different moral principles underlying what is acceptable or unacceptable behavior on the part of their forces? Or are you imagining a situation in which our own systems are constantly, iteratively adapting in order to reduce the asymmetries with the adversaries on the fly? And how would that operate in light of the human judgment that overlays this automated judgment? I don't know if the question makes sense, but I'll let you guys try to disentangle it.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I don't have a full answer to your question, but this notion comes up all the time, right? That says the short version I get from military people in military audiences is, why should we care about the ethics rules if the adversary doesn't care about them, right? Which I understand is not exactly your question, but there is this issue of what's the backstop, right? What is the limiting principle on how destructive we're going to be in a conflict with a peer adversary? I am bullish on the just war principles, and I think one of the things that I am actually worried about, and I have been working on in my day job, is that I think the way that we teach ethics, at least in the United States Air Force, again, not speaking for the service, but speaking about it, is that we're kind of stuck in a global war on terrorism model. And a lot of those case studies are, there's one bad guy on the back of a motorbike and he uses one kid as a human shield, and now what are you going to do with this moral dilemma? And those stories are great for distilling the moral principles. They're very bad at preparing airmen for the horrors of great power conflict. And so part of, I think, what we owe the sort of current generation is to show them just how scalar the principles of discrimination, not really discrimination, but proportionality can be. And that a lot of destruction can be morally justified in the context of a just war, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm not an expert on how to build that into the systems, but I do think those principles they have been and they should continue to be the underlying principles that govern how we fight.
The only thing I'll add is that's a great answer and a great set of questions, so thank you for asking them, is that one thing that we traditionally try to do in professional military education, at least for Western military forces, is to get people past naive realism, when it comes to thinking about conflict. And I actually think that most people engaged in conflict in the world have gotten past that, and that there is some fundamental agreement about a lot of the basic principles that ought to regulate warfare so that we contain it. They may not always be followed. There may be weakness of the will. There may be temptations of statecraft that will cause you to override, for reasons of national interest, following any particular rule. But in general, I'm with Jim Cook and others that there's actually radical agreement about some of the basics. Now, will those basics need to be adapted to situations to acknowledge the context that you mentioned in your fantastic presentation? Of course. There are ways we can do that. I think we will essentially need to build into something like an artificial conscience the capacity to engage in deliberation about rules of moral salience, to borrow Barbara Herman's language. And I can talk about the technical details of that if you would like, but it's not going to be that different from the combination of hybrid methods you get when you go about building a general purpose intelligence in general in AI.
I'll just add two quick things. One is that Sean Hagarath, he has a paper called The Most Dangerous Fiction, which is about this kind of West versus China race to artificial general intelligence. And he's shown fairly persuasively that a lot of the view that China is racing towards artificial general intelligence without any safeguards, anything like that, is largely false, right? And in fact, China has applied more deliberation on exactly what they want out of AI than the United States and Britain, which is his primary focus, have, right? So there's also this kind of converse problem, is that our thinking about that actually stops us from pushing the brakes on our own work when other countries may be trying to actually push the brakes as well. One of the things that we have looked at is that this moral context problem can actually also arise within allied groups, right? So if we're thinking about cognitive enhancement, for example, the French, who have a position on human enhancement, they think about human enhancement at the level of organizations rather than as individuals within the military, right? So their benchmark for what is an enhanced warfighter is not someone who individually is more lethal or more survivable or more capable. It's, does their unit survive more often than not, right? Where they don't believe that there's like a direct relationship between those two things. So you could imagine that these moral differences could actually hit fault lines between allies as much as they do between adversaries.
Thank you so much for this wonderful panel. A couple of questions. First, mainly for Bill. So if, for example, one of the things that's holding back autonomous vehicles, even though maybe they're already safer in terms of casualties than our own driving, is that we expect from them an even better and more consistent safety record than from human driving, so that the standards for accidents are even higher. How comfortable are we going to be psychologically with non-deterministic systems as artificial consciences, as opposed, because LLMs are non-deterministic systems, as opposed to sort of more old-fashioned AI? Because those systems, I assume that's part of why, for example, Apple is lagging behind in integrating them. They operate more in frenetic ways than traditional AI. So that's one thing I was wondering about. And then a question more for Nick and Joe about the argument about speed and the sort of speeding up of the decision process. I guess one question is, there's a distinction between the speed in which information is presented to you, which is faster than acquiring information traditionally. But our cognitive processing skill is a different variable. And it seems like if that's not enhanced as well, then your chances of getting overwhelmed just grow. Basically, you have a lot more information presented to you a lot more quickly with the same processing capacity as you had before. So For the decision speed to speed up, both of those would have to be sped up. But it seems to me that we primarily have the technology to speed up the former and not the latter. So that's one question. Then I guess the other speed-related issue is that even if we ignore that and sort of battlefield kind of loop closing or Joe, to go to the 972 example, if it is true, probably the problem results not so much in what, I think we chatted about this a little bit yesterday, the problem results not so much about what the AIs identified, but in the loosening and the laxing of the criteria between combatants and non-combatants that took place somewhere slowly in an office before. So I guess if you could comment on the sort of general speed issue, both in terms of the information speed versus cognitive processing speed and the distinction between speed and the deliberate setting of criteria for the AIs.
Yeah, did you want to go first?
No, please, yes, sir.
So on the second question, I think my solution hits both prongs of the question, I think, and that is I think there's a widespread but false view that in order for, let's say, the U.S. military to employ AI-enabled autonomous weapons, there has to be a human in the loop. And I've been arguing for a long time for people to stop using that phrase. I think it helps hurts more than it helps. But I can imagine tactical scenarios where I'm perfectly comfortable in a sort of time and space bounded domain to employ lethal autonomous weapon systems against specific target sets that machines are really good at distinguishing between, right? So to me, the difference between trying to get autonomous weapon systems to perform well against, Navy capital ships in the Taiwan Strait, for instance, and against humans in an urban environment, those two problem sets are worlds apart, right? So I want to throw the machines at that problem that's easy for machines to solve, and I think that's the place where you can capitalize on the speed, right? So it's in that environment, I don't think I need the human cognition to keep pace with the machine cognition, because the humans have decided in advance that these target sets, these things, if you find one of these things, this is a combatant entity and you can blow it up, right? Then I think the discipline is on the military organization to say, okay, now where are the environments where we aren't confident and we do need more human judgment? To me, that's not a technical problem to solve. That's more of a doctrinal, tactics, techniques, and procedures problem to solve, to say where are we going to carve up the responsibilities for purely machines versus machine-human integration and all that kind of stuff. So I think that gets around sort of both concerns that you raised.
I think there's also the, so I think actually under your program, so like DARPA, for example, has been looking at the ways that people process information to, even without kind of anything exotic, try to optimize the ability of humans to process information at high volumes in kind of cognitively actionable ways, right? And a lot of this doesn't just come down to kind of instances of direct use of lethal force, but to signals processing, for example, right? We have artificial intelligence that can scrape and collate massive amounts of data, but it still has to go to someone who then has to present it to a principal who has to then make a decision. How do you actually present it in a way that someone can then understand it, right? So in terms of like bringing, in cases where the human does need to be in the loop, bringing the human up to speed with the amount of information and the quantity and the volume at which it's been described by the AI, that is a process that is ongoing, right? So you're kind of, I think it's probably like more a normative claim, like surely we ought to make sure that humans are able to keep on. I mean, I wouldn't put anything past anyone, but I think that people are doing that.
The funny thing is that so one of the keys for quick processing is actually knowing less. I mean, one anxiety that Joe and I have talked about in the past in this context is you have generals in the Pentagon with, screens of very granular level happenings on the tactical level, now sort of micromanaging what they really should not have known about for, the sake of good management. So it's almost a counterintuitive picture of cognitive processing.
Yeah, to piggyback on that, I think the reference Nick was making was to this DARPA program I ran called Narrative Networks, which looked at the neurobiology and psychology of narrative and storytelling. And I think narratives essentially serve as a kind of heuristic to allow us to quickly resolve a lot of cognitive problems that we confront on the battlefield, like who's an adversary and who isn't. And I suspect that as our AI methods, like certain types of large language models, become better able to embody narrative reasoning, that they might become a step closer toward exercising the kind of phronesis you see in a well-trained soldier. And there's actually a technical development in large language models called diffusion LLMs that attempts to solve the attention window size problem that we solve very naturally with our big brains. And so that's the technology to track right now, I think, if I were in the stock market investing in LLMs, find diffusion LLMs and how they resolve frame problems. And that'll kind of speak to those last two questions of yours. On the first one, I think you're exactly right. The dynamic you've identified in autonomous vehicles, that would be an example of allowing the great to be the enemy of the good if we can demonstrably show that autonomous vehicles are safer than people. And I think the real hitch to adoption is explainability and interpretability. And even when we have had accidents that autonomous vehicles have caused, people have kind of relaxed a bit when we've done the forensic analysis and have allowed these networks to articulate why it was that the accident happened, because then we can think about practically how we engineer a system that prevents that kind of accident from happening again. And so as LLMs and others forms of AI get better at explainability, interpretability, I think there'll be less of a barrier of allowing the great to be the enemy of the good.
So a question that's maybe for all three, but I guess sort of focused on the risks slide from Dr. Casebeer's presentation. I guess, what do you think about the potential risk of a deliberately created responsibility gap? So I'm kind of thinking there could be people in politics or in the military whose primary demand for building an artificial conscience isn't to make better decisions, but to deflect responsibility for bad decisions. Either, maybe the decisions are no better or worse than before, but now there's no one to blame, or they get a lot worse and you've got kind of cover for that. And I'm kind of thinking a little bit about the allegations about Lavender, the AI system used by Israel, which at least seem to suggest that there's some people who are interested in that kind of approach maybe. So I'm wondering what you think of that kind of risk.
I agree it's a risk. I think there's nothing new under the sun here, and that even though there is general agreement about the normative values we ought to enact on the battlefield, that there will be incentives organizationally, individually, at the group level, the unit level, to overlook those. What I'm most reminded of as you asked your question, which is, I think, an excellent one, is Hannah Arendt and her remarks about the banality of evil, right? So we always need to be on the prowl for thinking about how we build in safeguards that prevent incentive in hard times from overriding what in cooler times we know to be a better judgment.
In another space, I've worked on issues around, people always worry, well, what happens if the AI makes a mistake? And it's like, well, the AI will make a mistake. That's what systems do, and it doesn't matter which AI we're talking about, whether it's kind of stochastic or more deterministic. The problem always is that artificial intelligence can make mistakes at scale in a way that, like, humans just aren't productive enough to do that much harm that quickly most of the time. And I think that one of the interesting things about what you're talking about is that, like any institutional system, artificial models are going to be vulnerable to corruption by human beings, right? And the difference here is that, unlike a lot of other systems, there are really critical vulnerabilities where you can achieve certain versions of corruption, again, at scale, very, very rapidly, right? So we already see this to a certain extent with reports about, for example, Facebook's altering of algorithms in very, very slight ways to change people's preferences for certain things. My good friend Rhiannon Nelson has a book under contract with OUP at the moment called Cyber Genocides, which is about their complicity in, like, for example, the displacement and massacre of Rohingya in Myanmar, right? So the difference here is that, people do genocides, right? But people with AI can do genocides really fast. And I think that this is always going to be a problem with these systems, is that as they concentrate power, they provide this kind of wedge that people who are corrupt can do worse things with.
I'll just make a comment from the other direction. There was a case, there was a Predator event years and years ago in which they shot the wrong people. Predator didn't strike them. They called in a two ship of Apache helicopters that shot the wrong people. And the LA Times FOIA'd the transcript of the Merc chat where they're talking to each other between the crew and outside the crew. And so you can it's out there, you can read the whole thing. And it's just devastating because I can see the various places in this chat where they should have known better and didn't. Right, so one example that comes to mind is that the people got out of their vehicles to pray, and the crew interpreted that by saying, that's just what the terrorists do, right? Like, yes, that's what everyone in the country does, right? So because they didn't have that education, they misread a bunch of the signals, and the most tragic part of it is the last line when the pilot looks at the sensor operator and goes, well, I mean, how could we have known, right? When the answer to the question, how can we have known, was better training yesterday. Right? I can't help you right now in this moment. You have the training you have. If we had provided better training yesterday, you could have known better, right? So in your example, I'm going to tweak it slightly and assume that it's not an intentional accountability gap, but nevertheless, suppose that this artificial conscience makes the wrong recommendation, right? What's the difference between everybody looking at each other and going, well, there was no way for us to know, and actual accountability? I think it's better training yesterday. Right? So I have a very strong view about this, thus the book in August, that the baseline understanding of how the machines work has got to be higher than what it is right now, because otherwise people are just going to hit the I believe button, and when the machine makes a bad recommendation, everyone under the reasonable person standard, all these reasonable persons are going to look at each other and go, there's no way for us to have known, right? Where actually that reasonable person standard is plastic. We can control that, and with better training, we can improve what we can expect from a reasonable person. So I don't think there's a good way for the Department of Defense to acquire these tools without that commensurate education at the no kidding every airman, every soldier, et cetera level.
Thank you guys for this panel. I'll say, so I don't often get to ask questions of people who work in military ethics. So my most recent connection is seeing the opera Grounded at the Met, which you might know about. If you don't, it's fast. But anyway, the plot is basically that there is a woman who is remote controlling a drone, and she has difficulty integrating her personal life, like separate, like compartmentalizing, basically. And so I was really interested when you said that, or proposed that people might enter the military with the expectation of cultivating virtue. And again, I'm coming at this from someone who is like very outside that system. So it seemed like you were presenting this idea that people might enter with this expectation. Neurotech is going to block the cultivation of virtue, and like that might be a problem. But I kind of wonder, one, my question is, do people enter the military with the expectation that they'll cultivate virtue?
Yes.
Well, that's fascinating to me because I would not think that's the case. But if that's the case, then I would wonder, is it neurotech that is blocking that cultivation, or are there certain things that are expected of someone who enters the military that block that cultivation, such as coercion, right? Having to do things on authority. Like, is there really cultivation of phronesis that's happening apart from the neurotech? Like, is the neurotech actually the problem? And I'll say, in some ways, I'm thinking about this in an analogous way to higher ed, where, so the military from the outside strikes me as a very consequentialist system, which is why the cultivation of virtue thing is like, I'm having trouble making those two things fit together. And what we see in higher ed is that students who enter college with a very consequentialist aim, which is that they want to get a degree, are not going to cultivate phronesis. They're going to use AI. They're going to they're just like, what is the shortest path to success? From the outside, it seems like a lot of military things are like that. Like, how do we compete with China, right? Like, what is the shortest path to competing with China? So how does the cultivation of virtue fit in that system even apart from neurotech, I guess is my question.
Yeah, so I certainly don't want to say that neurotech is the problem, right? If you're interested, you can read, I think the book is called Alpha. It's the story of Eddie Gallagher, who was charged with war crimes and then not convicted of war crimes. And the only reason I mention that book is because the author describes this battle within the Special Operations Force community, but especially the Navy SEALs, between the Boy Scouts and the Pirates, right? And it is a battle for the soul of that organization. And so if you are a young person and you join the SEALs and you find yourself in a unit that's dominated by pirates, you are going to cultivate vice, right? That is what is going to happen to you most likely. So all that to say, that is an extreme example of how this is a live issue. Like part of my job as an officer in the military is to influence the institution toward the Boy Scouts and away from the pirates, right? So I don't want to give you the impression that we got it all figured out and it's perfect and we never make mistakes. I will say, if you just go look at the advertising campaigns of the services, they are absolutely messaging to 17 and 18-year-olds that this is a place where you can cultivate virtue. In my service, our core values are integrity, service, excellence. The Army's are duty, honor, country. The Navy and Marine Corps is honor, courage, commitment. The Space Force has like 7, and I have not memorized them. But the point is that those aren't just tropes. Those really are values. Which is not the same thing as virtues. But so my first response is to encourage you that the United States military takes virtue very seriously, even though we sometimes fail in pockets to build cultures that cultivate it. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that I fully agree. I've got 2 kids in the military presently, so we have 4 children, my spouse and I, and one of them is now the intelligence officer for the wing that accomplished the rescue of the downed F-35 pilot in Iran. And the other will graduate next year from the Air Force Academy, God willing, and do good things. And they both joined the military because they saw it as a pathway towards the cultivation of wisdom and of enacting phronesis. I think sometimes we come to the table when we reason about the military with, and I'm guilty of this, kind of a broken mental model about what military virtues are like, where we assume that it's all about obedience and deference and judgment, when really it's almost the opposite. We endow people with incredible power. We tell them that they are in exceptional circumstances. And then while we do a lot of training and education and embedding of doctrine in that, they ultimately have to exercise judgment. It's a phronesis enhancing capacity, stem to stern, I would say. I think that Joe will do a great job as he continues his research about how neurotech might impact phronesis. I think one area where we have a mismatch actually doesn't have anything to do with neurotech as such. It's rather that our services, especially the Air Force, honestly, from my perspective, is still coming to grips with what it means to implement technology in the service. And we have a mismatch between a 15-year-old who has a martial virtue conception that's a little bit like Achilles on the battlefield in Greece. And that is just really does not bear much resemblance to what most martial activity is like in the U.S. Air Force. The way that came to me most strikingly was when I had a friend of mine who was a classmate that was shot down while enforcing the northern no-fly zone in Iraq. This was in the late 90s. She was on a helicopter that was doing a UN observation mission, and a 2-ship of F-15s thought it was an Iraqi helicopter, and so they rolled it on it, and the second of the 2 ships there was really excited, kind of in the sense that you might think somebody who is very aggressive is, and you can hear it in the transcript that you review after the fact and listen to the audio tape, and as he pickles off the missile, he actually says, "Stick a fork in her, she's done." And the lead command pilot is doing his best to impose a different type of phronesis and martial virtue here, where he is running a script, following a procedure, remaining calm and professional. And so he just radios back in a calm and professional voice, "Come again, number 2." And then the guy has to repeat what he just said in a normal voice. "Stick a fork in her, she's done." And you realize something's gone wrong here. And then, of course, when they both return to base, they learned that they had shot down a friendly helicopter. So that's an example of the type of mismatch, I think, between some very ancient conceptions of martial virtue and what executing procedures and making judgments in the air at least looks like, how those come into tension.
I just want to add something here. I think that one of the things, so I'm the Australian equivalent of a 4F, right? Which is I am medically unfit to serve in anybody's military for any reason. But I've taught at command colleges in 5 different countries now. And I think also one of the things that we also see as civilians is we get 2 versions of the military, right? And as a millennial, these are my versions, right? There are the people that you learn about who survived like medvacs being crashed and then hauling people out of the desert, right? Like the heroes among heroes. And then for me, it's watching like Colin Powell lie to the US government about the existence of weapons of mass destruction. And it's sometimes hard to put these things together. And one of the things that I've found is that, I know lots of good gentlemen like this who are, who have commissions, right, in the military. But I've also met a lot of enlisted people, and many people from this country who go into the U.S. military do so to find a better path to their life. Now, is that phronesis, like in like an essential Aristotelian sense? But they are looking for purpose, and the United States military gives them a sense of purpose. It gives them discipline. It gives them friendships. It gives them a sense of loyalty and understanding of like the world in which they live. They often do very badly if they leave under bad circumstances like medical discharge, because they are ripped from their purpose. And I think that it's in those spaces that I see how, for better or worse again, the US military provides people with a path to a sense of like a in the virtue sense, like a lived ethic, right? Rather than just like, is this a good or bad thing to do? Will this maximize consequences? But like, what does a good person do? They now understand because they get up at a certain time and they have a job and they have friends and family and stuff like that. So yeah, I find that the average experience of the people that I now work with is very, very different from what we would understand from kind of reading just about the way that the military works for people in the military.
Thank you for the really insightful panel. Had a question about what has been, I think, a growing area of attention around brain injury in military theater and the effects of brain injury on topics you've discussed, like virtue, judgment. And I wondered, as you've pursued each of your paths in thinking about enhancement and the next generation of autonomous warfare, to what extent might we have affirmative obligations to safeguard the warfighter from a neurotechnology standpoint, and might these neurotechnologies be themselves safeguards on injured warfighters as an inverse to the question of what safeguards might be needed for the autonomous systems themselves?
So you rarely get to apply for a grant on like enhancing soldiers. Like some agencies you do, but we don't tend to use those phrases. One thing that the US military in particular, the Department of Defense, is very fond of is maintaining warfighter performance. And this goes to exactly what you say, because a lot of what we would consider enhancement technologies are really about preserving the fitness of people as they go through their military career. Because the longer you serve and the higher a level you serve at, especially in special operations forces, the more expensive you are to replace for the US military. And in some ways, at some points you can become irreplaceable, just in the sense that like you have a set of experiences that it would be impossible to do again because you don't have a time machine. There are programs, for example, trying to use genome-wide association studies to figure out what biomarkers might exist for susceptibility to CTE, right? And the idea here is that this might, in principle, a friend of mine at Rowan down in New Jersey and I have kind of an idea about how to study this. It might in principle give you kind of better allocation decisions for assignments, right? If you know someone has a biomarker that is definitely going to lead them to have brain injuries from like repeated exposure to like minor traumatic events, maybe don't put them in the artillery, right? And this becomes then a way for this science to actually better preserve the people who are going to serve in these Western professional volunteer forces by making sure that they can actually be kept in a whole state for as long as possible, and or we know when to give them, like move them off their assignments so that they are no longer at risk, in the same way that you can only serve on nuclear submarines for so long before, you know, the amount of radiation that you are exposed to kind of hits a critical level and the Navy goes, you gotta go back to land, right? Or onto a ship that doesn't have a reactor. So yeah, there are lots of ways that this neurotech could actually be life and welfare preserving, in addition to kind of the cyborg, super soldier type stuff.
Yeah, I'm with you and with Nick. We have a positive obligation to develop technologies in this direction. Places like the Biological Technologies Office at DARPA, BARDA, some of our other research agencies are actively doing that. One small program that was in my portfolio at DARPA was something called the blast gauge. It was a type of neurotechnology. It was just a simple accelerometer gyrometer unit that you would put on your helmet, and it had a stoplight on it. And it turns out that there's a lot of subclinical blasts, that won't result in any phenomenology of injury, that nonetheless accumulate and cause traumatic brain injury that could be detected with this gauge. And so it could just tell you when you should get off the line or when you should go see your doc. And so we need more things like that for these more invasive technologies. I will say, though, I'll just volunteer this, we have more serious systemic issues we need to deal with on this front, right? TBI and PTSD are intimately intertwined. PTSD is the most likely condition that a military member were discharged with. The gold standard treatment for PTSD is cognitive behavioral therapy. CBT is not currently covered by TRICARE, the military medical system. It's because to do so would bankrupt the system. So let's deal with that, and then we can work on simultaneously some of these safeguardings for our BCIs.
Yeah, I'll only add that, and I'm hesitant to say this to a medical professional, but as I understand it, within our sort of institution, there are really two roles for medicine. One is, you think about someone who got legs amputated and is out of the military. The role of the VA is to do what they can to make that person whole, right? So that's about restoration for the rest of life, not in uniform. For many of the medical professionals on active duty in the service, it's actually a different function, which is how do I get you good enough to get you back to a readiness status where I can employ you. And this was most clear to me in reading the World War II, post-World War II histories, official histories of the Air Force, that the flight docs, man, like their job was to get those people back in an airplane. What do I have to do to get you well enough to go fly tomorrow? And this is a very different approach than trying to make somebody well for the rest of their life.
Yeah, and just really quickly, we've obviously, as someone who's kind of on the outside, we've obviously learned a lot about things that have been lost within the Department of Defense in its current administration. And one of the things that I'll point out is that military ethics capacity within the DoD has taken a hit, right? So Matt Johnson, who was at the Chief Defense Artificial Intelligence Office, he was rotated off. He was implementing some of the AI principles. He's a DPhil in philosophy. He studied with Ray Langton at Cambridge. Pauline Cowran has moved to Australia. She was at the Naval War College. Some of the people from the US Naval Academy have been rotated off. Jake Earl, who's currently the head data ethics guy at the VA, he's had his job duties constrained. Liza Dawson and Walter Reed. The Defense Medical Ethics Committee at USAS, which is the military's medical school, has largely been closed, right? So a lot of this administration has done damage to the military medical ethics and military ethics capacity within the Department of Defense, and that is going to be another thing that, if you meet these people, obviously buy them a cup of coffee, but also understand that these people did this work within the Department of Defense and worked very hard to build some of the kind of virtue that Laura was asking about, right? And they are definitely hurting right now.
Okay, there's a few final questions, but we're a little over time, so let's thank our panelists.